So Eric Prince wants to recolonize parts of Latin America and the whole of Africa. The fight over George Santos's vacant seat was fought over by two people trying to prove who loves Israel more and who hates immigrants even more than that. Sean Hannity casually watched Curtis Sliwa's goons beat up some dude from the Boogie Down on live TV, and Benjamin Netanyahu thumbed his nose at Joe Biden by bombing refugees in Rafah during the Super Bowl. We having fun yet? UNFTR. Amidst the daily pressures of life, the 2024 election looms like a dark cloud on the horizon, inescapable and foreboding. A fractured American electorate will be herded together like zombies on a single day to cast their lot with two nearly indistinguishable political apparatuses. It's little wonder why polling data is so untrustworthy. We're mad at the same people for different reasons. Awash in anecdotes that promote confirmation bias, the American people are united in their disunity and struggling to piece together a semblance of order. Dumb content from dumb people relentlessly streaming through smartphones and smart TVs, pounding away at us like a hailstorm. We are uncomfortably numb. Numb to the horrors unfolding in the world around us. Numb to the images out of Gaza that flood our social media apps. Numb to the bodies we step over in the street. Numb to the violence and rhetoric, legislation, and actions of our fellow travelers on Earth. Since October 7th of 2023, 1,130 Israeli citizens have been killed by Hamas. In response, the number of Palestinian casualties as of this recording are as follows. In Gaza, 28,340 people killed, including 12,150 children and 8,300 women. With an estimated 67,984 injured, including 8,663 children, 6,327 women, and more than 7,000 missing and presumably dead. In the occupied West Bank, there are 390 dead, including 102 children, and 4,450 injured. Last month, the New York Times ran a rather optimistic piece titled "The Decline of Deaths in Gaza." Quote, the Israeli military announced a strategic shift 2 weeks ago. It has reduced the number of troops in northern Gaza, and the most tangible sign of the change is the decline in deaths among Gazan residents, as reported by the Hamas-controlled local government, end quote. And yet, while 123 million Americans tuned in to watch the Super Bowl, Israel commenced a bombing campaign in Rafah, located in southern Gaza. This is where the vast majority of the displaced Gazans from the north were told to flee as the IDF leveled entire cities, hospitals, every single university, and even cemeteries for good measure. 16 cemeteries to be exact. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu blithely stated on U.S. television that the refugees in Rafah were given plenty of warning to return to the north in advance of the bombings. Of course, there's no place for these refugees to go and no ability to get there. And so they waited. And more were murdered. And there it is, the word that the New York Times was surely searching for. Murder. A decline in deaths? Death is the result. He died. Really? How? Heart attack. He died. Really? How? He was murdered. Two very different narratives. The way we talk about conflict and violence matters, and yet we've become so immune to the horror that we don't think twice when reading something as benign as a decline in deaths. Hannah Arendt remains one of the most important historians and philosophers of the 20th century. She's responsible for the phrase, "the banality of evil," which is taken from her book of the same name, in which she reflects on the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi credited for architecting the final solution. Judith Butler, a modern-day giant in the fields of philosophy and gender studies, understands Arendt as deeply as anyone. Quote, her indictment of Eichmann reached beyond the man to the historical world in which true thinking was vanishing, and, as a result, crimes against humanity became increasingly thinkable. The degradation of thinking worked hand in hand with the systematic destruction of populations, end quote. There's no need to wonder what Arendt would make of our society today. As a German-American Jewish scholar writing in the mid-century, Arendt had many thoughts and connections to the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. While she favored the creation of a safe haven for the Jewish people, she was hardly a fan of the Zionist project and thought that the native Arab population should live equally among Jewish refugees in a secular political state that was collaboratively formed. Even during Eichmann's trial, Butler writes, quote, She thought that the trial necessitated a critique of the idea of collective guilt, but also a broader reflection on the historically specific challenges of moral responsibility under dictatorship. Indeed, that for which she faulted Eichmann was his failure to be critical of positive law. That is, a failure to take distance from the requirements that law and policy imposed upon him. In other words, she faults him for his obedience, his lack of critical distance, or his failure to think." End quote. This is Thoreau's civil disobedience to the nth degree. Support for the war in Gaza, though, remains incredibly high among Israeli civilians, a sentiment that Netanyahu does not enjoy as his approval ratings continue to falter. But support within the halls of power in the United States remains just as high, despite the obvious collective punishment of the Palestinian people. A growing number of young voters and ethnic minority groups are calling for a ceasefire in Gaza at a minimum. But the Biden administration appears ready to ride out the storm and hope that the slaughter turns to background noise by the time of the election. Even our supposed allies in the region are incapable of changing the administration's calculus in Gaza. Taking the podium at the White House after a meeting between leaders, King Abdullah II of Jordan implored a visibly uncomfortable President Biden to take action to halt the genocide. Before Abdullah took the podium, though, Biden offered his own remarks. They began with the usual both-sidesism admonishment before acknowledging the imminent assault on Rafah and included another verbal gaffe in which he referred to it as, quote, "our military operation." Have a look.
As I said yesterday, our military operation in Rafah, the major military operation in Rafah, should not proceed without a credible plan for ensuring the safety and support of more than 1 million people sheltering there.
And yet, with America's eyes trained to Taylor and Travis, the operation began. Are we really that powerless to change the facts on the ground in Gaza? I know this much: our money and our mouths are in two different places. The powerful in this country are riding roughshod over the objections of the people. And as righteous as many are in calling for an end to the atrocities, the leaders we elect to represent us are making us complicit by proxy through money and munitions. We are one step removed from the IDF soldier who partakes in the massacre of children with American weapons. The same soldier who is failing to, quote, take distance from the requirements that law and policy imposed upon him, as Butler suggests. Arm's length distance in the United States may make us less complicit than those who pulled the trigger in blind obedience, but complicit nonetheless. This is a national disgrace. We need a better class of leadership in this country. But do we even deserve it? There are barbarians at the gate scheming to manufacture the next atrocity for profit. Take Eric Prince, who recently proclaimed on his own podcast that perhaps it's time for us to recolonize parts of Latin America and the whole of Africa.
All this talk of illegal migration in Europe, in the United States, it ultimately comes down to a contest of what is governance. Who is governed? Which countries are governed well? And if so many of these countries around the world are incapable of governing themselves, then it's time for us to just put the imperial hat back on to say, we're going to govern those countries if you're incapable of governing yourselves, because enough is enough. We're done being invaded.
Because our own national security risk is at stake.
Exactly.
National security interests are at stake.
You can say that about pretty much all of Africa. They're incapable of governing themselves and benefiting their citizens, because the governments there are all about looting and pillaging and lining their pockets and going shopping in Paris instead of actually making their country a better
People on the left are going to watch this. They're going to say, wait a minute, Eric Prince is talking about being a colonialist again.
Absolutely.
The pretense for this statement was a discussion about the U.S.-Mexico border. See, Prince blames what he calls ungovernable countries for global migration crises rather than the destabilizing effects of capitalism, neocolonialism, and climate change. Prince is currently the head of a private equity firm, but he's most known for his connections to several armed mercenary groups such as Blackwater, which he founded. And here's why this idiot's sentiments matter. First off, he's still referred to as a shadow advisor to Donald Trump, so his star may be on the rise once again. Second, these kinds of destabilizing war efforts are familiar to him. I mean, he's not just any talking head with a podcast. He's literally the godfather of modern mercenary warfare. Oh, and he's Betsy DeVos's brother. But here's the part that I found most interesting about this conversation.
Look at what El Salvador did. Bukele, murder capital of Latin America, he said, no more. Now, El Salvador is safer than Prince William County.
Now, I've mentioned Bukele of El Salvador in our newsletter a couple of times now. His staggering re-election numbers are a big deal in Latin America, and we need to pay attention to them here in the United States as well. See, for years, El Salvador has been one of the largest countries of origin for migrants entering through the southern border. According to State Department data, quote, El Salvador went from 4th largest source of migration to the United States in 2020 to 11th largest source in 2023, end quote. Credits being given to the administration and self-styled CEO tech bro Nayib Bukele, who refers to himself as, quote, the world's coolest dictator. Bukele rose to fame as a dynamic mayor of a relatively small town all the way to the presidency, where he has stymied political opponents and traditional parties every step of the way. Aside from flashy projects and declaring Bitcoin a bankable currency, Bukele has captivated the imagination of Salvadorans through his extreme incarceration policies of gang members. Of all the dubious rankings to achieve, El Salvador now has the highest incarceration rate per capita in the world. Over just a couple of short years, Bukele has turned El Salvador into a veritable police state, rounding up tens of thousands of citizens suspected of having gang affiliations. As a result, crime has plummeted. The economy has gained some traction, and Salvadorans no longer fear for their lives on a daily basis. So that seems pretty great on the surface, but there's a clear tension there for those who value civil liberties, habeas corpus, and natural rights. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, is this the only way to gain control of countries that have a migration problem to the United States? Well, no, because there are other countries that don't have the same migration problems because they keep their people there because they want to be there, because they can prosper, and they have natural and civil rights. Now, I want to make an important distinction here. See, this is different from admiring Orban of Hungary or Kim Jong-un of North Korea. These leaders might captivate the likes of Tucker Carlson and Donald Trump, but they occupy relatively little space in our collective minds. Bukele, on the other hand, is very much in our orbit because of the number of Salvadoran immigrants in the U.S. and its geographic proximity, but mostly because it's offering conservative figures a blueprint to reform our border policies. How, you might ask? Well, liberals have long made the case that fewer people would seek asylum in the United States if we stopped the neoliberal policy of destabilizing Latin American economies and supported them instead. Today's inverted totalitarian state run by oligarchs is content to sell arms and tactical training to dictators. Now, practically speaking, we might not be able to secure the southern border with a wall or enough drones, but we do know how to foment civil war and overthrow regimes in the southern hemisphere. See, Eric Prince is just saying the quiet part out loud here. Bukele's success through authoritarian means will undoubtedly inspire neighboring nations who have seen an upsurge in migrant activity as their economies struggle. Now, honestly, it's hard to imagine many Americans even caring about violence in other countries when we have so many problems here ourselves. I mean, the other night, Sean Hannity was interviewing former New York City mayoral candidate, talk show host, and face of the famed Guardian Angels, Curtis Sliwa. During the interview, Sliwa pointed behind the camera and told Hannity,
In fact, our guys have just taken down one of the migrant guys right here on the corner, 42nd and 7th, while all this is
Can you pan the camera?
They've taken over.
So what you saw there is several Guardians were pummeling a citizen that they assumed was an undocumented immigrant. Turns out, he was just some dude from the boogie down Bronx who was trying to disrupt the interview. And Hannity just shrugged it off. Fox issued a half-hearted apology the next day. The Guardians went about their merry way, and the man who was accosted was given a summons for disorderly conduct. And the world kept turning. Hannity's nonplussed response to a man being beaten on camera is all of us. Now imagine years from now, Palestinians putting us on trial, showing us footage and asking us what we were thinking, allowing these atrocities to happen. They would point to corporate oligarchs like Eric Prince who darken the hallways of power and speak about imperialism with impunity. They would enter our treatment of migrants into evidence, condemn our obedience, our lack of critical distance, and our failure to think. Indifference is complicity. Here endeth the lesson.